Hello, everyone, and welcome to our series of talks on advanced reproductive techniques. I'm Dr. Brian Hyde from Hyde Veterinary Services by Sylvan Lake, Alberta. We're going to touch on ICSI today. ICSI is one of the advanced reproductive techniques that's gained a lot of traction in the horse world in the last few years. And there's always a lot of questions that come with ICSI. Simply put, what is it? So we're going to give a little bit of an overview of ICSI, kind of the process, what's done, and why are we using it as one of these techniques. So some of this information is coming from our good friends at Solo Select. They put out some wonderful educational materials that help with this as well. And so we want to reiterate a little bit of that, add our own little take on it for this talk here. So what is ICSI? Everybody uses ICSI when they're talking about the process, but a lot of people think of it as the whole thing. The ICSI itself is when a simple single sperm cell is put into an egg outside of the mare. Now, there's a lot of things that go into this before we get to that point. The first step in ICSI is going to be collecting those eggs. And then those eggs, or oocytes as we call them, will be sent to a laboratory where they can be fertilized. Then we make embryos from those fertilized eggs in the laboratory. And then we can either put them into a recipient mare or we can freeze those embryos for later use. So what we want to do at the beginning of the whole process is we want to take and evaluate those mares. So we will take a look at them every 5 to 7 days usually to try and see when and where the best time is to actually collect those eggs. So by doing that, we can find out what that mare's particular best number is. Now, there are times of year that we can get kind of an extra flush of oocytes. One of those times is the spring transition. In the wintertime, because of the day length breeding that goes on with mares, we will have a lot of mares that'll have a big flush of follicles, and each follicle contains an oocyte. So if we have a large number of follicles, that means that we have an opportunity to get many more oocytes and increase our odds of getting successful embryos from that. So we just have to remember that every mare is very different, okay? And that's what makes things a little bit tough, because everyone asks about averages, and in this situation, for the most part, a lot of mares have their own average. So their own average is going to be what we have to go after. So that means the success rates for every mare are the success rate for that mare, and not overall as a population. Okay. So first we go ahead and we take a look every 5 to 7 days, trying to find out when the very best time is to go after those. Now, if we're not going in for the spring transition, which usually is somewhere between, in Canada, it's going to be somewhere more so around that March into early April is where we get that first flush, and then we get a lot of opportunity to get some good results. If we don't have that and this mare is cycling already, then we have to kind of look at the cycle and just find a point where we know that we have probably the most number that we can effectively go after of follicles in order to try and maximize the amount of oocytes that we can get. So after we've gone through the process and we've determined what the best time is, now we're at go time. So the next step in this process is going to be aspiration. So some people call it OPU, ovum pickup, or transvaginal aspiration. So in that process, we use a probe like this, which is an ultrasound probe. There's a needle guide that comes right along the top there. So what happens when we do the aspiration, the mare is sedated in the stall, and we use this ultrasound guided probe in order to remove those oocytes from the follicles. So we will put this probe in vaginally. The veterinarian will put their arm in and we'll locate the ovary. The ovary is brought into approximation via the rectum right beside this probe. In that situation, then a needle can be passed using the picture that we see on the ultrasound. It's passed in directly into that follicle, and we suck that oocyte and the contents, and we flush several times through, scraping the edge of the follicles and retrieving as many as we can. Retrieval rates, when we talk about doing aspiration, can vary quite a lot. Some mares, very, very high collection rates. We can get up to 80% on some of them. Some of them are very, very poor as far as their recovery rates, and we can be as low as 30%. Okay, so those situations are kind of, again, mare dependent. So this process is one that, again, is a day procedure. So the mare comes in, everything is set up. The actual procedure itself, not usually more than about 45 minutes to an hour and a half if there's a lot of follicles. But sometimes that's just kind of an individual situation that we're kind of working through. So the next step after we do the aspiration is in the laboratory here at the clinic, we would go through, collect all of them. We run them through a series of just washes to make sure everything is good and there's a minimal potential for contamination. And then they're packaged, put into an incubator that we can send at a defined temperature, and we courier them to the lab directly. The last time that they spend outside of the horse and not in the right area is going to be important here. So with the least time that it takes from my facility to the lab, the better. So we put them in special media in order to make sure that they thrive while they're going there. When they get to the lab, then the actual process of ICSI starts. So, which ICSI stands for intracytoplasmic sperm injection. So when they get to the lab, we have to mature the oocytes. So these eggs, when they come out, can have various states of maturity. So they're put into a media that kind of matures them over a period of about 48 hours. In that time frame, we can see whether or not they develop to the right stage that they need to be in order to be injected with a sperm cell. So we can have some losses in that period. Some eggs are just far too immature and they won't respond. Others may be too mature and they are on their way out, and so they have a predisposition to die. So we'll find the very best ones that are there. Those ones will be injected with the stallion of your choice. So once we get that stuff to there, at the time we got to make sure, and this is where it's important that everyone makes sure that they have all of their contracts in place and done. This is kind of one of those ones, and it's same thing for when we're breeding horses and stuff like that. We don't want to have something held up just because something wasn't dotted or crossed out in the contract. And so making sure that we get that is very, very important. So, so again, we're now outside of the mare and we're at the laboratory. This point here, the injection procedure is done. This is a microscopic procedure where the egg is punctured and after one single sperm cell has been picked up and from the preparation that they've made, and it's basically injected directly into the egg. Once that process is done, then they go on and they're kind of left alone in order to kind of do the process of once fertilization has happened. We have to see whether or not these eggs will cleave. So you'll hear the term cleavage. Cleavage just means the beginning of cell division. And so once cell division happens, that's kind of our next step. We want to know the numbers of those that were injected that will go on to the next stage, which is cleavage, okay? Cleavage does not mean that you have an embryo yet. An embryo is an organized division of cells, making the appropriate structure in the end, which is a blastocyst, which is what we term for an embryo proper. Okay, so that procedure is going to be a period of over. We'll start to know a little bit more as we get towards 5 days after we have done the actual injection. We should start to see potentially the next stage of the process, which is going to be embryo formation. So lots of times, and we will term a lot of these times because we include the days that they were maturing. 7, 8, 9 are going to be some of the days that we're going to have some things that are going to happen. So now at this point in time, we have, if we do get to the point of embryos, this is where the decision has been made as to whether or not we're going to put a fresh embryo into a recipient mare, or are we going to freeze these and use them later? Now, one of the interesting things that's happened with a lot of these embryos is that we found that the frozen embryos are actually having very, very similar conception rates to the fresh embryos. So it is a very viable thing to do to try and get that, that embryo, freeze it, put it in that recipient mare at the very exact proper time in order to make sure that we get a good pregnancy to develop and stuff like that. So we have the option of doing either. If we have a recipient that's ready and is at the proper time, great, we can put in that fresh one. But if not, we have that frozen one that we can thaw, put in, and we can expect similar kind of results. So that being said, ICSI embryos are slightly different than what we call in vivo embryos, or embryos that we would get naturally from an embryo flush, from an embryo transfer. These tend to have a little bit more of a delicate nature, so we tend to get a higher degree of early embryonic loss with them. As such, most of our recipient mares that are put embryos in from either a frozen or a fresh ICSI will go on some form of progesterone supplementation or progestin supplementation like Regimate or a long-acting altrenogest, long-acting progesterone. This is fairly common. So now, why would we actually do ICSI? So ICSI is one of those procedures that there's a lot of benefit for certain mares, okay? Certain mares that are competing, well, they can't afford to take the time off in order to actually do the process of breeding and kind of doing stuff while they're trying to keep their show career active. So these mares that can continue to be active and competing, and they can just go in for a day procedure, have them done, and carry on. The other ones is if you have a high show situation during the actual breeding season, one could do ICSI at the end of the season in the fall and still take enough embryos so that you have some that are available and ready to be put in for spring. So a very good option for a lot of show mares. Now, age of mare, ideally, we'd like to have them greater than 3 years of age. So 4-year-old and up is wonderful. Late 3-year-old, it's not really recommended for these very young mares. I think that there's some people that would say that it's a little bit hard on them, and they're maybe not quite as mature enough to reproductively in order to be kind of doing things at a high level as far as reproductive situations. So the other benefit is you're not really laid up for any amount of time, right? So again, we talk about the show horse or any of those other horses. It's when you go to the breeding shed or go to the veterinary clinic and stuff like that, you can expect sometimes a 2 to 3 week potential for a 2 to 3 week period, depending on how far you have to haul or do things. So this can be an alternative as a day procedure where it's in and you can take your mare back, pretty much the same day. And that basically decreases stress, decreases a lot of things with that. So one of the other bigger benefits, multiple babies. The potential is there when we take and aspirate all these oocytes that we can get more pregnancies out of one mare than one could expect with traditional methods like embryo transfer and whatnot, with maybe a lot less time involvement. So this is great for valuable genetics. There's a lot of stallions that have passed away that have very, very limited frozen semen. For those animals that don't have very much for frozen semen, this is going to be one of the only ways that you're going to get access to that valuable stallion, and because only a fraction of a straw is ever used in order to do this. So one could expect sometimes 20 or 30 attempts off of one straw, whereas a regular breeding dose could be anywhere up to 8 straws for doing that. So one of the other big ones is the mare that cannot carry themselves. Now, this procedure will bypass the entire uterus. So mares that have cervical issues, mares that have endometritis or bad scarring, or are grade 3 edema or grade 3 scores for their uterus as far as endometriosis and stuff. So those are the ones that are very, very infertile. And even the process of doing an embryo transfer can be very, very hard to even have that embryo live through and get to that point where one could flush it. This thing, we're doing everything outside. We're bypassing the uterus itself and going directly to the oocyte. So this is a very, very good thing for doing any kind of infertility work with a lot of them. Horses that have oviduct blockages, another one. Those can be very frustrating. Unknown reasons for why they don't conceive. So that's another big one for this. Sometimes when we talk about embryo transfer, everyone, we talk about when we flush a lot on a lot of these mares, after several years of flushing some of these mares, these valuable mares, we can kind of expect there's a bit of reaction again, because again and again we're going in and out with these embryo flushes. Sometimes scarring can develop, and the long-term viability of that can decrease, right? And that means that the usefulness or the ability for us to do that can be compromised. So this provides another avenue to keep getting valuable ones, babies off of these mares without having to go through some of the deleterious effects of long-term flushing on these. Older mares at the very end of their, there's a cautionary note on an older mare, and we're talking about mares that are well above 20 years old. They don't usually make as many follicles, so it's a little tougher to get these babies, but this sometimes may be the only way we're getting a baby. A lot of times their uterus is not very competent at this point in time, and we're getting more to the end of their reproductive life. And so therefore trying to get them this way might be one of the only ways we can do that. Now, our caveat to that is that some of these mares that are very, very old, also, if you think about it, their pool of eggs that they got were kind of defined when they were a baby. And so over time, when we're talking about 20 years, the DNA that's part of that has aged as they've kind of gone through their life and whatnot. So therefore, subtle damage can happen to the DNA. Chromatin quality can be lower, and therefore what we'll end up seeing is a potential for more loss in the older mare, and the potential to make embryos can be a tiny bit lower. So, but that is an option for them, okay? So now, this is the one thing I want to really stress. This is not the be-all, end-all. I want to be sure that everybody knows that this is one of the tools in our kit. This is not a guarantee of success. This is can be an amazing thing for some, but it can be a disappointment for others. There are lots of different things that can happen with this, and every mare is different. And so I want to, going back to what we talked about at the very first part of this talk, was that a lot of these mares, they we have their own average, and their own average may not be the best as far as numbers go. And again, it's a numbers game, so we always want to see that that is there. So oftentimes there is some that will make lots of embryos, and there's others that consistently come up empty, even on this. And we've had scenarios where I've pulled 15 or more oocytes and basically had a zero count for embryos, and that's a disheartening. And the expectations are there for success, but that mare had something with her development that didn't quite work. And then the next mare, I could maybe only get 7, and get 5 embryos from that 7. So we got to always be looking at those numbers and saying that can be something that's normal for that situation. It's not a magic trick. It is a powerful tool, though, and one that I think has been growing in the industry and allowing us to do more with what we've got. So for many, it's it can be the way that we can get to that next step in our reproduction career. So anyway, I just want to leave you with this thought that a lot of these procedures are gaining much more popularity. Ask questions, find out what's going to work the best for your mare, and don't always go with. You always have to remember that if somebody's telling you that it's always going to work, just be a little skeptical in that situation. Just be sure that you ask enough of the questions and get the right answers, and that they're looking out for you as the mare owner, and trying to get things so that we can have 4 legs on the ground and a happy breeder. Okay. Anyway, thanks for listening. This has been a great talk, and stay tuned. We're going to have several other talks on a few different topics in advanced reproductive techniques. Thank you.